Hello, gentlemen. So, if you're rewatching this, I did not like how my first lecture went, and so I am re-recording. I hope this is for your benefit, so that way you understand everything I talked about better. However, first things first is hello, welcome to our new restructure of the class. I know it's a little confusing, but I do want to thank you for your flexibility, especially with this transition of figuring out the best way to teach hybrid. I talked with a fellow colleague of mine about what he was doing, and I'm modeling off of what he is actually completing in his lab, as well as his classroom. Where if you are online, you are watching the lectures in advance and you are doing homework assignments or activities, and then those that are in person are completing labs. For those of you that are 100% online, you will be completing labs that I have uploaded to Canvas. But until then, I'm just trying to figure out the best way to get you the content, and hopefully this works out and these lectures get better and I don't have to go back through and re-record later, so that way you get the best information to really benefit you. My plan today is when you are in the lab, you're going to be able to review graphing and a lot of the content I'm discussing. However, I want to review graphing pretty heavily. I also want to talk about how to use your scientific calculator. If you don't have a scientific calculator, like this one or the other one that's approved, please get one as soon as possible. But these were the calculators you used for physical science, and so I'm assuming you should at least have one. Otherwise, they're like $10, really cheap. Your homework you will be completing following this lecture is a basic skills worksheet, and it's due by next online class for you. It's a pretty easy worksheet. All I'm asking that you do is it's a PDF. I uploaded it onto Canvas. You'll complete it on Notability, and you'll submit that file when you're ready. And then next week, I will have the answers posted, and you'll just look over it to see how you did. I am planning on showing you Canvas right now so you understand the structure of it in case of the future. However, I did cover it, so this is a lot of review for you. So if you go to Canvas, mine looks a little different. I'm going to have it organized where I'm actually thinking of moving our lecture stuff up, much like I'm doing right now, and having a lot of this stuff separated in some way. I am planning on, I will upload my virtual lab link, and that will be through YouTube, but I will have the date or the dates that this runs through, which is 4 days in total because we have A day, B day. So then you will watch the lecture and complete the worksheet. I have all the virtual lab stuff down here. It's not posted yet, and you'll know what to complete. I also am planning, and this is a early sneak peek at next week, you will see. I'm making an announcement for every week for the agenda for that week. And I'm separating it where example is this is Monday and what blue cohort is doing, what the white cohort's doing, and what you're doing if you're 100% virtual. And then I've changed it so Thursday, Tuesday, Wednesday, blue cohort, white cohort, 100%. And then our Thursday, Friday with white cohort in person, I have that information as well. Once everything is posted, I'll have it linked here. However, that's all the information I have for you. So I'm thinking about doing all of that stuff to really keep us on track, and I'm hoping that it will help ease a lot of our stuff that we're going through. Oh, I did not mean to open that. So that's kind of how Canvas will be organized. But yeah, I'm hoping it'll be a lot more successful for us. I know I could present it up there, but this is so much fun. So that's our plan for today. Now, I'm going to kind of go through some review topics we already discussed earlier. So the scientific method is something that I want you to understand pretty heavily, but the goal of it that I really need you to understand is it allows us to design an experiment that answers a question that can be repeated and will produce a reliable result. So for example, we'll have two variables. We have an independent variable and we have a dependent variable. What we do is our independent variable, it's manipulated. So when I mean it's manipulated, a good way to note is that it's something I'm changing. It won't be the same for everything. However, I'm changing it over maybe time, or I'm adding something to it, maybe varying amounts. It's just something that is independent from the regular. So I'm changing this lone variable, and it's only one variable. So I'm only changing one thing in my experiment. My dependent variable is what we're going to measure. It's responding to our independent variable. So think about it this way. When you are independent from your parents, you don't need anything from them. You don't really need their help. However, right now you're dependent. So your parents are independent because they have their own money, they know what they're doing, they're living their own life. They're manipulating what their life is like. They're in control of that life. But you're a dependent on them. So you need to borrow money from your parents. So you respond to what your parents have because you're dependent on your independent parents. So that's a good way to remember it. And I'll talk about some lab applications that you can see. Your controls are everything that's kept the same. So for my parent and child example, your control is maybe your family dynamic stays the same, where you have two brothers or a sister or a younger brother, an older brother. You live in the same house, you have the same dog. No matter what, all these controls will be the same, and you're still dependent on your parents in some capacity, even if they're the ones that are doing whatever they want and you're responding in that way. I want to practice this now, and so my plan is eventually I'll figure this out. But right now, I want you to write in your notebook each of the practice examples, and then I'll go through each one. So we're going to do the first one together. The first one reads that a study is done to test how much longer a new battery will last compared to an older version. So I have to get my independent variable and my dependent variable. When I read through this, I know, okay, a study is done and I'm testing how much longer a new battery will last compared to an older version. So I'm testing two different types of batteries. So right there, I can tell you that my independent variable is my different batteries. I'm testing different batteries. So I'm manipulating the batteries I'm using, maybe by age, brand. I'm just using different batteries. My dependent variable is the time, because I want to know how much longer these batteries last if they are new versus old. So my independent is my batteries because I'm changing it, and my dependent is my time because that's what I'm measuring. Next is a study is done comparing how effective bleach is at killing bacteria. Please pause this video and write down your answers. All right. My independent and my dependent variables for this. A study is done comparing how effective bleach is at killing bacteria. So I'm trying to study how effective bleach is. And now I can do this using different brands or different amounts. So my independent variable is my bleach, whether I use it or not. And my dependent is the presence of bacteria. I'm measuring how effective my bleach is at killing bacteria. So I can watch and say, oh, it's killing this much bacteria, it's this effective. I'm testing the bacteria. I'm measuring the amount that it kills based on the presence of the independent variable. And our last one is that research is done to test if spending more time practicing chemistry problems increases grades. So take a moment to verify if you think it's the independent or the dependent, and then unpause this video. So right there, I know that my research is done to test if spending more time practicing chemistry problems increases grades. My independent variable is the time that I'm practicing chemistry problems, and then my dependent is actually my grades. The reason why is I'm varying the amount of time I spend working on my chemistry. If I spend a lot of time, my grade can be very positive and reflect that by having a high A. If I spend little to no amount of time practicing, then my grade will reflect that I'm not using the practice or the materials given to me by Mrs. McCaslin. So I'm going to have a lower grade by having a lower amount of time spent on studying chemistry. If you have any questions, please let me know. So now a controlled experimentation example that we're going to cover is, does fertilizer help plants grow? In this case, the amount of the independent variable is the amount or type of fertilizer used. So I can use a different amount of grams of fertilizer. I can use different brands. It just depends on what I want to study with my fertilizer. So because I'm changing it, that's my independent variable. My dependent variable is actually the plant height because I have to measure it. So I can physically measure my plant's height in the response of the amount or type of fertilizer that I'm adding. My controls of this experiment would be the type of plant, the type of soil, and the amount of sun, and also the water that I'm giving the plants. You don't want to favor a couple plants because your data that you're collecting won't be considered good because it's not accurate to what every single test subject, in this case the plant, is experiencing. So I have to keep it controlled in that environment. With my independent and my dependent variables, when you are graphing, it's always important that you note that your independent is in the first column in a table and your dependent's always the second. If you remember in math specifically, when you do tables, you have an X and your Y. Your X was always on the left-hand side and your Y was always on the right-hand side. And so you were doing a lot more of that when graphing. So a good way to remember is when you were in math class, you always did X, Y. So when you're making a table, your independence, your X, and your dependence, your Y. And you can reflect that in the graph. If you need more time to write down these notes, pause the video and I'm going to continue moving on, but don't be afraid to pause this video at any time just so you can get the notes down. These are the graphing skills that you need on the ACT. So right here it says the graph below best represents the relationship between concentration and temperature for which of the following substances. So I have two graphs over on the right hand side, and then I have my information in my figure 1. So the graph below, which technically is the side, best represents the relationship between concentration and temperature for which of the following substances. And so you're going to compare the graph information with the table information to find what's the best figure for you and what the graph is. And so being able to understand what's in the table and what's in the graph is extremely important with the ACT, because if you don't understand how to interpret a table and how to interpret a graph, then you won't be able to really excel in that portion. So really practice on what you're going to be doing when you're studying this. However, these are very different graphs. And so, yeah, just know that you really need to have a good understanding of graphing skills when you're taking the ACT. So now we're going to get into some vocabulary. So our direct relationship is a positive slope. And our direct relationship is when both sets of numbers in a table are increasing. So as you look over here, I'm going to do a laser. No, it's not a laser. There we go. My independent variable right here is increasing the lower I get on the table. So I'm going up by 2s. But while this is increasing, we can also see that the dependent is increasing. So the more fertilizer I'm adding allows for a bigger amount of height, like a taller height in the plants. And this is seen in my graph because I have an increase in my graph because I have a positive slope. My indirect relationship is when I have a negative slope, and it's where one set of numbers is increasing and one is decreasing. So as you can see, I'm still increasing my fertilizer by 2 grams. However, my height is actually lowering. When I had 2 grams, I had 10 centimeters, but by the time I had 10 grams, I was at 2 centimeters. This means that I had an increase in fertilizer, but a decrease in plant height overall. And so I actually have a negative slope where it goes down because it's decreasing on the y-axis. And my flat relationship is where I have no slope. This means that one set of numbers is increasing, but one stays the same. And so while I'm still increasing by the 2 grams of fertilizer, I'm not really seeing a drastic change in between. And so I get a flat line for my slope because the amount of fertilizer I'm using does not affect my plant height. And so I show that by just having no slope, by having that flat line. And it's really used when you can't see a lot of change over time. The general trend, the relationships we just talked about are right here. So just know that a direct relationship is where the XY are changing in the same direction. So they're increasing. The inverse is where one goes up and the other goes down. And our flat line relationship is where we do have an increase in at least our X value, but the other stays the same. In that case, the variables are not related. Why do we graph is an excellent question. We graph because in chemistry, we want to identify general trends that we see. These trends are always going to be used in line graphs, and this is what we use in chemistry. We never use bar graphs. We never really use pie graphs. We're very big line graph kind of science. And so understanding how to identify a trend in a line graph is extremely important. Also, using line graphs allows us to identify and eliminate any outliers that we might have in our data. And we can see outliers when we use our best fit line, but our best fit line also allows us to predict what could happen later on. And so we can make an educated guess on what might happen if I had 20 grams of fertilizer by using the graph that is a positive slope. And so I can infer from there, hey, I'd have an increase in height by this much. Okay, so the parts of the graph, which I know this is a lot of review for you, but it's still important you remember and recall a lot of this information because when you're giving me a graph for your lab data, I do expect to see all of this information on it. And so I do have an idea of what you need to have on the side here in the picture. However, I also made a key. So all of your graphs should always have a title. And so like this, while I don't have a traditional title, I did title it line graph in the corner. I had my X value, my X axis with my independent variable as well as the units. I had my Y axis, which is my dependent variable with what it was as well as the units. I labeled them. And then I also included a scale that increased at a constant rate, which is extremely important. I can't go from like 0, 1, 5, 10. I have to keep it at a consistent rate. And so I was able to showcase that on either side. I had an increase in my values. You can never have a decrease in values. You will show your decrease in values with your slope. So it's always important, no matter what on your axis, that you're going to increase, not decrease. And it's always going to start at 0 and move into those larger numbers. So those are the parts of a graph. It's just important to review that. Your best fit line is what you use with your line graph, and it's your average representation of the trend. It's not a dot to dot. And so when I mean no, not a dot to dot, here we go. If this is my graph, I'm not going to connect the dots as I want. I will just draw a straight line, which that's not straight, to show the trend. That's what my best fit line is. It also lets me point out any outliers of data points that are outside of this line. So for example, right here, this dot would be considered an outlier because of how far away it is. Another example would be this dot right here. That's an outlier from this data set, along with a couple other points there. It's because they fall outside of my best fit line, which means they are not on my trend. That best fit line represents what is my average representation, which I just repeated all that. So make sure you know that. So an example of this is how could you predict how long an entire candle would take to burn? You would use your best fit line and extrapolate the data. So when I see that, I want you to ask, based on the trend that you see, what can you predict? And so typically what we would notice is that the longer our candle burns, the less mass that it would take. It would take so long that what happens is you'd start with your starting mass, you'd take the data, you'd make your best fit line, and then you could go and say, oh, it takes 30 hours for this candle to no longer burn. And that's an example, rough estimate. When you're in doing scientific notation, which now we're like switching up what we're doing, scientific notation allows us to write very big and very small numbers. So excuse me for that. So what I mean by writing the very big numbers is I mean if I have 1,000,000, I can make that into a more digestible part instead of having all those zeros written out. When you're writing your scientific notation number, every number has 3 parts. You have a coefficient, which is the number right here, and this can only be expressed between 1 and 9.99. You have your base, which is always a 10, and then you'll have your exponent. And your exponent is what represents how many decimal places I'm moving over of the values of zeros that I have left behind. So in this case, this is 4.67 times 10 to the 9th. So I would move my decimal place 9 places over because the number is getting bigger because it's a positive exponent. How to use your calculator is something really important, and this is just a reminder. When you're doing an exponent, you have 2 options on a lot of these calculators where you can do the caret to make your exponent, or what you should be doing is using your EE button. So right here on this calculator, this is what our EE button looks like. But on here, it's one of our second functions. And so I'd hit second, and then I'd hit x to the -1 to have my EE function. The EE represents our exponent. So never use your operator buttons for times 10 to the x. And what I mean by operator buttons is these buttons here. You're never going to write x here. So it's just important that you note that you're not going to use these buttons as your function buttons. You're always going to look for EE or second EE like I talked about. And when you have a negative exponent, you're always going to use the change sign to denote that. You will not use the subtraction sign. It will cause an error in your calculator, and so it's extremely important that you know you're using the change sign, not the minus sign. Now we're going to practice, so make sure you have your calculator out. If you do not have a calculator, please get one as soon as possible and come back to practice. However, we are going to do 6.02 and then times 10 to the 23rd. So that's where you use your EE button. You are going to multiply it with 3.4 times 10 to the 12th. When you are ready, pause this video. If you're not ready, unpause it. The answer that you should get is 2.05 times 10 to the 36. Remember, when you are solving for scientific notation, because we have the 2 decimal places for 6.02, you're going to round to the 2 decimal places. And so in this case, you get an answer of 2.0468. Because the 6 is our 3rd decimal, we can round that 4 up to be 5. Next is 9.6 times 10 to the -34. Remember, you're going to use your change sign in your calculator, and it's multiplied by 6.3 times 10 to the -7. You should get 6.05 times 10 to the -40 in your calculator. Again, you're rounding to 2 decimal places here. So we're doing 6.048 is what we got. I can round my 4 up to 5. As a reminder, I need you to complete the basic skills worksheet. Again, that's a PDF under assignments, and so you will complete those by uploading it to Notability and then writing out your answers and resubmitting it. If you're having issues, remember I have a text box, so you'll just have to type them all in, and then make sure you have your supplies ready as soon as possible. So preferably next week. That's when we're doing a lot more labs and you'll be doing a lot of notes. Other than that, if you have any questions, email me, but have a great day. Bye.